Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jana Kolassa. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar in our Machine Learning for Land Modeling series. Thank you all for joining. Before we get started, I just wanted to quickly mention two logistics points. The first one is that this presentation is recorded. You probably got a notification just now. The recording and the presentation slides will be made available on the Machine Learning for Land Modeling schedule page if you're looking to find these later. And then the second point is that if you would like to ask a question, you should see a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Please just click that button and type your question, and then we will be answering them at the end of the seminar. So today I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Jon Cranko Page from the University of Oulu in Finland. Jon is a postdoctoral researcher in the Hydrology and Water Quality Research Group within the Water, Energy, and Environmental Engineering Research Unit. His research includes terrestrial fluxes of carbon and water, ecohydrology, and climate change. He utilizes eddy covariance data combined with other detailed observations to further our understanding of the coupled carbon-water cycles under global change. Jon has completed a Master's of Science in Hydrology and Water Resource Management at Imperial College in London and a PhD in Climate Science at the Climate Change Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. Jon is also a co-chair of the GREX Machine Learning and Benchmarking Working Group, and as such, he's a co-organizer of this seminar series. And today, Jon will be talking to us about using machine learning to identify conditions of underperformance in land surface models under the PLUMBER2 framework. Jon, it's a pleasure to have you. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Jana. Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Jon Cranko Page. And I'm currently based at the University of Oulu, as Jana says, but the work I'll be presenting is from my previous position at the UNSW Climate Change Research Centre in Sydney. I couldn't have done this work without all my lovely co-authors who are listed here in the bottom of the slide. Most of these people were involved in running land surface model simulations for me. And obviously, without that, I wouldn't be able to look into their conditions of underperformance. So today, the takeaway is going to be that our study, the paper that was published earlier this year in January, which used the PLUMBER2 benchmarking framework, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later, to basically identify across a wide suite of land surface models, that where they underperformed was pretty consistent. And one of these areas in particular was where two or more meteorological inputs and drivers were comparatively extreme. So that's where, relative to each other, they were in the edge of their distribution. And in these places, our land surface models should be able to perform better than they currently are, just with the information they're already provided. So as I said earlier, I would like to thank my co-authors on here, particularly Gab Abramovitz, who is my supervisor at UNSW and who is the driving force behind PLUMBER2, which is a benchmarking framework. So first of all, I just wanted to sort of discuss what I consider to be benchmarking. So you know, as AI and machine learning become more popular and out there, I feel like a lot of things are referred to as benchmarking. So what actually is it? So I looked up the Cambridge Dictionary definition of it. And I feel like the key sort of phrases that come out are this: you're measuring the quality of something. So how good is it? And importantly, you're measuring it against something else. You can't compare it to itself in any way. And then this something that you're comparing it to has to be of an accepted standard. So is benchmarking just comparing one model to another or to observations? Or actually, to get an accepted standard and for it to truly be something else, do we need to bring in some other form of performance measure? So here's a sort of illustration of where I consider benchmarking to sit. So you have your meteorological observations and your flux observations. So presumably here we'll be talking about eddy covariance towers, but Of course, your observations of fluxes and land-atmosphere interactions can come from a variety of places. And we have a land surface model, which throughout this is sort of indicated by this green tree and a cog. And when you're comparing your land surface model outputs against your flux observations, you're probably really doing this as calibration or validation for your model, which isn't really benchmarking. To some extent, you could bring in sort of a completely independent set of observations to benchmark. But then the question becomes, why do the observations, your two observation products disagree in the first place? There's obviously some sort of uncertainty there. So potentially this isn't really benchmarking. Alternatively, we could have another land surface model. But if we're comparing these, it's more into comparison. So, you know, what our model might be doing better than this blue model, but are either of them actually doing well? They could both be doing absolutely poorly, or conversely, our model could be being beaten, but actually they're both doing fantastically, and it's not really a problem. So what the PLUMBER2 framework introduced was this suite of hierarchical empirical models. And by hierarchical, if I'm saying that word correctly, I mean there are increasing complexity, both in terms of the number of meteorological inputs they take, but also in terms of the flexibility of the model structure. And it's by comparing our model to these empirical benchmarks that we can see how well our model is doing. And I think the sort of having the collection of empirical models is really important. If you were just comparing your land surface model against a single empirical model, it doesn't really give you too much information, because you also don't really know how well the empirical model is doing. But when you have a range of them in increasing complexity, that can give you a sort of idea of the amount of information being used and how effectively by the empirical models. And one other important thing is when it comes to benchmarking and trying to identify where models underperform, the metrics you take are super important. Obviously you could take something basic like RSME, but really that's only giving you one specific idea of a type of performance. And so as I've tried to illustrate here with slightly different colors on my abacuses to indicate metrics, when you're benchmarking, you want to take a variety of different performance metrics. And what was really cool about PLUMBER2 is we used some independent ones, which means that each one tells you something very different about the model performance. And so while we've used them for benchmarking, I also think it would be important to take this wide variety of metrics into other aspects of model performance. So whether you're doing intercomparisons or even validation and calibration, I think, there's something to be taken from the PLUMBER2 study in terms of the metrics and the different levels of performance they provide you. So PLUMBER2, the first paper for this came out in 2024, the very end of the year, led by Gab Abramovitz, as I said, a variety of people from the Climate Change Research Center, and then a wide variety of co-authors who are mostly based in model development centers and provided the model outputs. And what did we get the models to perform? Well, PLUMBER2 had around 20 land models in it, which all simulated the three turbulent fluxes: net ecosystem exchange, the carbon flux; latent heat, which is the water flux; and sensible heat. And we asked them to do this at 154 flux tower sites, which were provided with half-hourly meteorological inputs and had been very carefully quality controlled. And importantly, the land models were asked to run with no specific calibration to the site fluxes. So they were given some basic site information, so the vegetation type and some canopy heights, for instance. But they weren't allowed to try and calibrate the model, which sort of made it so that the land models were running as if they were in a global simulation, say. And then our benchmarks that we brought in were 7 empirical models just in terms of statistical models, and then also two very basic empirical hydrological models. And as I've said about a million times now, these are hierarchical, so they range from a very simple linear regression against incoming shortwave through various types of k-means clustering and regression into very flexible random forests and LSTMs. And importantly as well, these were all trained out of sample for each site. So none of the empirical models were trained on any of the data that they were predicting. And the key results for PLUMBER2 end up looking something like this. So along the x-axis, you have our three fluxes, so QH, the sensible heat, QLE, the latent heat, and NEE, the net ecosystem exchange. And on the y-axis, we have what the PLUMBER2 framework refers to as the independent normalized metric value. So this is 7 metrics, all of which are independent, which means that any time series, you can change it such that one of the metrics varies while the other 6 remain fixed. And then this is normalized. And so you can compare the land models against empirical benchmarks. And we include 3 on the plot from the simplest to the most complicated. So we have our simple linear regression called 1lin. So that's just a linear regression against shortwave down for each flux. We have a relatively flexible k-means squared using just 3 inputs, k-means regression, sorry, and a long short-term memory network as the most complex empirical model. And the result here, which I'm showing for cable, the Australian land model, is pretty consistent across the board. So the blue line is the performance of cable, and we can see that for sensible heat, it is outperformed by a simple linear regression. Then for latent heat, it beats the linear regression, but it doesn't quite beat what is a very simple k-means clustering plus regression. And it doesn't beat it for net ecosystem exchange, although for the carbon flux, it does perform best. And this is a figure from Gab's paper. And really, I won't go into the details too much, but you can see the story is pretty consistent across the board. So all these bold plots that I'm highlighting are the land models. And you can see that for sensible heat, the vast majority of them are beaten by a simple linear regression. And then when we look at the other fluxes of water and carbon, we can see that in general as well, they also don't do amazingly. Some do beat, so NOAA MP, we can see for latent heat, does beat the middle benchmark, but none of them beat the LSTM in anything, and very rarely do they beat k-means clustering. So our study was effectively motivated by asking why. Why is it that our incredibly complex land surface models that integrate all of our process understanding are easily beaten by a simple linear regression? What is it? You know, whereabouts is this happening in our forcing data, in our model structure? And we started to think like, well, are there certain conditions, certain places where this is occurring? So, you know, one of the most obvious might be to look at the fact that, well, this performance metric is aggregated across all the sites. But we have 154 sites. So you could look into each individual site, but that's a lot of sites to look at. And, you know, potentially also it's not even a site issue. It could be something else. So we decided to take a different avenue. The original paper did look at vegetation type. So it looked at the model performance based on the IGBP classification for each flux tower. But that didn't really show much. And I have beef with PFTs anyway. So yeah, we decided not to go that avenue. But instead, we thought we'd keep it simple. You know, these empirical models, the very simplest ones, are only fed meteorological conditions. So we decided, hey, let's see if there's specific meteorological conditions where our land models are underperforming. And how did we go about this? Well, the PLUMBER2 forcing data, so the meteorological input provided to the land models, and that was provided to our empirical models in varying quantities, has 7 key MET variables, and as well as LAI, so leaf area index. These are shown in this octagon down the bottom. So there's T-air, air temperature, VPD, vapor pressure deficit, long wave incoming, wind speed, precipitation, LAI, as I said, short wave incoming radiation, and specific humidity. But this is a really high dimensional data set. So you've got 8 variables and many, many time steps. So to try and simplify this down, obviously they're continuous variables that were measured. We decided to bin each variable. So we took the full range of each MET input. So for instance, temperature was something like -30 to +40. And we binned it into 50 equal width bins for each of them. And then by looking at each bin and putting each time step within the bin it fell in for each 8 things, we sort of define these kind of cells of very similar conditions. And then to help visualize this, because obviously 8D space can't see it, unfortunately, we collapsed it down to 2 dimensions. So for each input variable or each pair of input variables, you can plot one on the x-axis and one on the y-axis, and you end up with this sort of 2D pattern of the input forcing domain where you've got the variables increasing or not. And it kind of looks like a fingerprint. And based on PLUMBER2, it seems that land surface models are committing crimes of some kind against our process understanding. So we figured, fingerprints, that's a good one. So this has helped us simplify our MET domain into a space that is sort of understandable and visualizable. But what about the model performance? We wanted to sort of simplify things down again, like try and get some sort of binary. Is our land surface model doing as well as it could do, or should it be doing better? And so we thought it would be quite generous to the land surface model, and we only wanted to look at where it was doing worse or better than the 3 best models. So we have the random forest, we have k-means clustering plus regression, where we used 6 variables as well as their lags, and long short-term memory. So at each time step, we check whether the land surface model has enough information to perform better by looking at the error. And we check whether the error is worse or bigger than each of these 3. And if that's the case, we say it's an LSM loss. So it only loses if it's outcompeted by all 3 of these models. Then within each cell, so each time step is either a loss or a win, we can say. And then within each cell, obviously, we've got a number of time steps, and then we can calculate the ratio. So just simply divide the number of losses by the number of steps and time steps in the cell. And we end up with some figure that looks a little something like this. This is just a made up one to illustrate things. We'll get into it later. But this is the fingerprint, and the colors on this are the same as the colors I'll show you in the plots later. So because we're looking at an LSM and 3 empirical flux models, if the models were all performing exactly the same and there was just sort of random error within the models, we would expect a loss ratio of about 25%, where the LSM is only the worst performing a quarter of the time. So anything with a loss ratio more than 25% indicates that our land surface model could be doing better. And so we set up the color scale here. So anything less than 20% is in a sort of greeny blue, and that means great, our land surface model is doing really good, or at least it's adding information and adding understanding to what's going on compared to these empirical models. And as we get to darker red, it's doing a lot worse and is being really, we think, provided enough information to do better. So this is quite like, I don't know, I'm not even sure if it's complex, but it's convoluted. It's quite long. So the manuscript has a little schematic to show this. I think, yeah, so we ended up, there was 16 million time steps in the PLUMBER2 input data set, which we put into these bins. And what does this actually look like then when we collapse the 16 million time steps down into two-dimensional fingerprints? So here we have some genuine fingerprints from the study. On the x-axis on the right, we have air temperature. And on this plot on the left, air temperature's on the y-axis. I don't know why I switched it in the manuscript. I apologize. It's very confusing. And then on the y-axis on the right, we have our other drivers, while they're on the x-axis on the left. Now, you might be thinking, if you're paying attention, John, you said there were 8 variables in total, but here you're only showing 7. It's because obviously VPD and humidity are very highly correlated. So we didn't plot specific humidity just to try and create space in the manuscript. But what you can see is you can see the general shape of the sort of joint distribution of these variables. So for instance, VPD and air temperature, you get the very nice sort of physical relationship between how humid the air can be and the temperature. You've got a very zero-dominated rainfall. So you can see that here where we've got the number of time steps. And you can see the vast majority of time steps, so this is just the percentage in each cell, along the 0, which is the same for shortwave, because obviously nighttime, you get a lot less. And on the left as well, you can see that as we get to the edge of the joint distribution, there's fewer sites contributing. So these sort of extreme meteorological conditions, although it's important to point out, this doesn't necessarily correlate to sort of extreme weather. So, these conditions might occur without it feeling sort of, oh, the weather's really crazy today to anyone, Like, for instance, with downwelling long wave, when that's high, that just probably means it's very cloudy or something. So it's where, they're interacting to be unusually together. And here we have some fingerprints of the loss ratio. So this is from one of the key results in the paper. I've taken off the model names just to try and simplify things while I explain this. But on the x-axis, we have air temperature again, going from low to increasing. And then we've got 3 variables. So we've got VPD increasing, wind speed increasing, and shortwave increasing. And we have 3 different models. Again, greeny blue means the model is adding value, and darker reds and oranges mean the model isn't performing as well as we would like to see. So first of all, what we can see here is at low temperatures, we've mostly got some greenish blues. So these 3 land models are actually performing quite well here. We can see that model 1 seems to have this really strong temperature dependence for its NEE performance. So as temperature gets warmer, the model does worse compared to our empirical models. And then also what's sort of reassuring, I guess, is model 2 and 3, they're actually from the same model family. So they're both Orchidae models. And you can kind of tell this by looking at the fingerprints because they behave very similarly. And then what's most interesting is where these sort of darkest reds are and oranges tend to sort of occur at the edge of our distributions. So around the outside and along the edges, and within the middle, the sort of oranges are there. So we looked at this and we had 11 LSMs in our study. So PLUMBER2 had 20 land models, but we limited this down to the ones that can really be considered sort of land surface models. And then we can look at how these models perform collectively by taking the root mean square error of the loss ratio. So we here on the right have the fingerprints aggregated across all the land surface models. And as you'd expect from the PLUMBER2 result, where models perform worse with sensible heat, you can see that these fingerprints contain a lot more orange and red. And you can see again that these sort of mostly occur around the edge of these domains and the fingerprints. There's obviously, there's a bit of orange elsewhere, but in general, mostly around the edge. And we can then look at this on a per model performance. So now we have each column is a different model. And we have x-axis is air temperature again, y-axis are the various different variables. And it's a lot to look at, but just to highlight again, you sort of see these more darker orangey areas around the edge. And this is obviously speaking quite generally. So for instance, mass zero, you see this sort of bigger, darker blob in the middle. But the models kind of look quite similar, I think, and you have this edge effect. And it's important to point out as well, these sort of time steps, these cells, these input conditions, they also don't necessarily relate to extreme flux values. The fluxes can be very average here, in fact. It's just where the models are performing worse. So this underperformance, it could be only slightly worse for our land model against the empirical models, or it could be a lot worse. And similarly as well, I think it's also worth pointing out, that there are areas where our land models are doing better than some really quite good empirical models. So these sort of blue areas, again, for latent heat occurring at the lower temperatures, even though there's obviously probably not much flux happening there, our land model does capture that better than some empirical models. So we can zoom in a little bit, and again, you can look here. And so on the right, you have the two Orchidea models, and you can again see they have very similar fingerprints. And I think it's worth noticing that this is quite similar across models. So you can see this sort of the darker red clustering in this sort of upper left and the orange, and you can see this in quite a few different models. Obviously, it's slightly larger in some than others. And then here we have wind speed as well. And again, you can kind of see it starts to occur as the wind speed increases for various different temperatures. And again, you can see the models that do worse for this flux. But what does this actually mean for the PLUMBER2 results? So we've identified these time steps where our model could be doing better. Okay, so if our model did do better there, would our PLUMBER2 results, that land surface models are outperformed by linear regressions, improve? Well, to test this, we simply removed the time steps from the analysis. So we recalculated the PLUMBER2 metrics after removing various different time steps based on different conditions and filters. So in this plot, the black is the land model performance under the initial PLUMBER2 experiment. So again, I'm afraid they're not on the axis, I'm sorry, but this is sensible heat on the left, latent heat in the middle, and then net ecosystem exchange on the right, but this model didn't simulate net ecosystem exchange. And we applied 5 different filters to the time steps where we removed certain time steps. This orange one is where we removed only time steps that fell in a cell with 95% or higher LSM loss ratio. So the land model had to be doing consistently worse than our empirical models here. And when we remove them, as you'd expect, the performance improves, but it improves a lot. You know, we've removed sort of 10, 15% of the time steps, depending on the model. And we start to be beating some of these metrics, the benchmarks. And you can see here, even for CLM5 for latent heat, if we sort of ignore these in the analysis, we can see that actually our model all of a sudden beats the LSTM. So, you know, we'd be saying this was a fantastic result. But we want to check, you know, obviously we're removing some time steps where they're performing badly. Is this just what happens when you sort of remove some time steps? I mean, obviously, you know, you remove bad time steps, your model's going to perform better. So in red, we also tested where we removed the time steps with 50% or higher. So this removed a lot more. Time steps could be removing up to 50, and you know the performance improved, but not always substantially. So you can see for latent heat here, the difference between removing just 13% and a third of the time steps is pretty minor. There was also the idea that perhaps some of the conditions that are causing this, you know, underperformance are known issues with flux data. So it could be to do with the level of turbulence. So we also tried only looking at daytime data. So we just did a filter on incoming shortwave radiation and windy data as a sort of proxy for whether it's turbulent enough. But when we remove these data, which are these two blue ones, you know, this was removing sort of 50% of the data, and our models did worse. So there's not any sort of daytime or turbulence issues going on. And then also because of the way, you know, observations, eddy covariance work, there were some time steps where technically two or more of the Met drivers weren't physically plausible. So this was mostly sort of a temperature having a humidity that it wasn't possible for that combination to occur based on our physical understanding. And obviously, you'd expect land surface models to underperform in that case, because how are they meant to deal with this information? But when we remove those, it's this very pale blue, and you can kind of see there's very little change at all in the performance. So that doesn't seem to be the case either. And here we have the plot for all of the models, and it's pretty consistent. You can see that removing these models, these time steps, result in substantially better performance. And it's not a lot of time, sort of cells or time steps where this occurs. So that it implies that we can really target our model development into these cells, these types of conditions to improve our model. And this sort of fingerprinting technique, it doesn't just let you look at you know, relative benchmark performance, but you can also identify some of the error and bias, so comparing the model against the observations. So here we have the same sort of fingerprints. This is an older style plot, but you can see that you have sort of high bias, low bias based on the colors. And I think what's most interesting here is if you look over on the right where we have all the land models, you can see the land models in general are really quite similar. You know, most of them are sort of low bias in the bottom right half of the forcing domain and high bias in the top left, apart from, for instance, CH Tessel. So it'd be really interesting to sort of dive down and see what's going on there. And one of the key outputs of the PLUMBER2 is that you can run all this sort of analysis yourself with your own land surface models by going to modelevaluation.org. And you can download the model forcings, so the input data set. You can run your model and then upload your model outputs, and it will give you some plots much like this. So these are the sort of mean LSM error taken from the supplement of the manuscript, which is why they're very low quality. Apologies for the lack of pixels. I couldn't find the originals on my new laptop. but you can sort of see where, again, model patterns across the fingerprints are very similar. So this is for sensible heat, where you can see sort of the colors in general are a bit darker. You've got similar patterns again around the edge, or where the larger errors are identified. Doesn't, of course, mean that the fluxes there are bigger. And then we have them for latent heat. So with this, you can sort of see that in general, our LSMs seem to be underestimating latent heat. But if we go back to sensible heat, you can see it might be more of an overestimation. And then you have net ecosystem exchange again. I won't get into this too much, but again, you can see that some models have, so this is NOAA MP, which had the very strong temperature sort of bias in its performance, where it performed worse at higher temperatures. And what's interesting here is that the type of underperformance changes as the temperature increases. So this kind of does okay at lower temperatures, then it really underestimates it, and then it overestimates it. So by combining sort of the benchmarking plots, which give you an idea of where the models could be doing better, with the plots of error, you can get an idea of potentially what might be going on. So just to wrap up and summarize again, so using the PLUMBER2 benchmarking framework, where we compared land surface model error to empirical benchmark error, it would appear that our land surface models could be doing better, that they're currently underperforming in and around the edge of the joint distribution of input space. The models also do well in certain places. And so I think really to get the most out of this, it is a tool for land surface model developers, where what they can do is they can use these plots and techniques and empirical benchmarks themselves, and then look into and target the specific conditions where their own model is underperforming, which, while it might be in the edge, is not necessarily what we'd understand as extreme weather or flux conditions. So that's it. Is yeah, a little quick, I guess, sort of, hopefully, and just sort of a bit of an overview. There's a QR code for my manuscript, or you can always drop me an email. Thanks again to my co-authors, and yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jon. This was very interesting talk, very fascinating way to go at like trying to sort of dig deeper into land surface model performance. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
If anyone has a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box or raise your hand. And then I can unmute you if you want to ask a question in person. Maybe while we're waiting for people to type their questions, I can indulge myself and ask a first question. So one thing I was wondering was that usually, people always say, oh, like machine learning models or regressions in general are not good at capturing extremes, right? So
Yeah.
and now, so I was a bit surprised to see that here we see at these in these extreme conditions that the actually sort of physically based land surface models perform worse than the more like, statistical like regression models. So do you have an interpretation of that? Like what's going on there?
No.
Okay.
I think it's a really good point. It's one of the things that kind of really shocked us, because as you say, these sort of, regression statistical models have a tendency to regress towards the mean. And in these sort of areas where you're, again, like the flux might not be extreme, but the inputs are outside of, the mean of the distribution. And especially because a lot of these sort of more edge conditions are only occurring in one or two sites. And our empirical models were trained out of sample. So they probably didn't even see these conditions in their training. And yet they're still performing better than our land surface models in this case.
Mm.
Which, yeah, I mean, I think is very interesting. And it it's where you would expect maybe our process understanding to be providing some benefit to us. Like, oh, we know, at what temperature things start to break down or so on and so forth. But yeah, I think the fact that that isn't the case in terms of we could be expecting our land surface models to be doing better there is very interesting. But I'm not sure why this is the case, I'm afraid.
Oh, that's fine. I guess more work to do and more things to
Yes,
look at.
exactly. Yeah. I'll look into it.
All right, right, yeah, exactly. Okay, so we have a question in the chat by Sharia Ahmad. So the question is, this framework indeed exposes the deficiencies of land surface models, but can it really inform what improvements to make to correct for those deficiencies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think it's definitely one of those things where it's a lot easier to sit and say, yeah, it's wrong, but not to say why. But
Mhm.
I do think, as a tool, I've been speaking to a few different sort of people involved in model development, and they really see a use for it. But I do think it's a case of you're going to have to sit down with these results for your model and looking at where it says you can improve it, you're then going to have to delve into the model outputs, into the kind of errors and biases you're seeing, identify, you know, rather than just looking at the full flux, you might have to start breaking it down into its different components and having a look at, if you're talking latent heat, you might need to look at evaporation, transpiration, or potentially, photosynthesis versus respiration. And then you might get some sort of idea. But I mean, it's one of I don't want to say failings, but one of the issues, right? Like when you do a big scale study of a lot of models and a lot of sites, you naturally have to sort of aggregate stuff to try and at least be able to comprehend the information being given to you. And I think you know, you always lose something in that, and then you need to use what you've learned to sort of dive down deeper into the specifics.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is by Rowan Feely. Was there any geography to the flux sites where the models did not perform well?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's a very logical thing to ask. Uh, if I'm completely honest, we didn't look at that specifically here. I think just gut feeling would tell me there might be a little something. But arguably, because you're only looking at one or two sites for these, it's difficult to tell, is it a geography thing? Is it a specific site thing? Um, for the original Plumber study, so this was Plumber 2, there was an original one back in 2015 or 16 where it was a lot smaller scale, but Ned Houghton did do a lot of work looking into potential reasons for the mismatch in performance there, because that had a very similar result to Plumber 1 and Plumber 2 both showed that this sort of linear regression is better than our land models if all you want to do is predict a flux. And there it didn't really look like it was a specific geography thing. I mean, if anybody looking to fund flux towers is out there, though, it definitely is a geography thing, and you should go and stick up more flux towers in underrepresented areas to help improve our model development. But yeah.
Thank you. I think Swahil has a question. Oops, sorry, disappeared for me. With respect to the edge comment, are we really looking at extremes given that we're looking at only joint 2D distribution and not the full 8D space?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of, you're collapsing stuff down and aggregating. I mean, they're edge conditions insofar as there's, two of your input variables are occurring at values that don't often coincide. In most of those, I think the other variables are probably a bit more normal considering things. It would definitely be worth, I think, looking into trying to sort of pierce this out more and see whether it is sort of an edge condition in 3 or more dimensions. It's not something we looked at, and I'd be intrigued to know of any sort of, not just visualization, but sort of, metrics or techniques you'd think you could use to consider that, I guess.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no more questions in the chat. So I'll indulge myself again and ask another one. So this is somewhat of a biased question on my end, but I was just curious. So all of the models that you've shown are just plain land surface models. And I was wondering whether anyone has used this framework with a land surface model that was constrained by data assimilation and see whether that actually helps address these issues that you're seeing, and how then the performance comes out of the land surface models compared to these regressions.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, no one has. And I think, it'd be very interesting to see, right? And I think you'd naturally, obviously, expect them to do better. And potentially, in some ways, it's a more fair comparison. As we move into more sort of data assimilation and bringing these things into operational models, then is it still fair to be testing them, with no calibration, sort of a global spin up? So on that side, I think, yeah, definitely that'd be super interesting. On the other side, I'd argue that, if our process understanding is correct, then our models shouldn't really need much data assimilation. And so this is showing that there is potentially something going wrong in terms of, or missing wrong. I mean, I don't want to be too controversial, but yeah, there's something happening within the model that isn't quite allowing us to extract the information that we could.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I mean, maybe on that note, do you think are you planning to maybe dive deeper to, like, so now you've identified the conditions where the land surface models are not performing well, to trying to diagnose the actual processes that are, causing this poor performance, or is that even possible within this framework?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to. Just last week at the Panglass conference, I was talking to a couple of people who were interested in sort of looking at this for their particular land surface model or scheme in more detail. So I think, yeah, there's potential, and hopefully we'll get the chance to and watch this space, I guess.
So David, you have your hand up, and I have given you permission to speak, so I think you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good, right. Apologies if you answered this in your talk, but were your empirical models trained site-specifically or globally?
No, yeah, so they were trained, there was 154 sites, and each of the models was trained on 153 and then predicted the 154th. So like each empirical model is actually 154 models combined into one output.
So hold on, say that again.
Yeah, so the empirical models.
Okay. Your model for a particular site was trained on the data for all the other sites.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's wonderful. Right. Thanks. Right.
No problem.
All right. Are there any more questions? Feel free to raise your hand if you have one. All right, I'm not seeing anything. So yeah, thank you again, Jon, for this really interesting presentation and the interesting discussion afterwards. And for everyone else, thank you for attending. And I think our next seminar will be on September 15th by Joe McNorton, speaking about the Sparky model. So I hope to see you all then as well. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.